When my brother Samuel died, the world seemed quieter, as if some part of the air itself had gone still. Yet when the old lawyer's letter arrived, sealed in black wax, that silence seemed to hum again with something unseen. The inheritance was peculiar. An enormous grandfather clock, black wood polished to a coffin's shine, its pendulum swaying like the slow, hypnotic beat of a dying heart. It arrived at my home late one evening. The movers brought it in with strained faces, setting it in the hallway as though eager to be rid of it. They avoided looking at it for too long. I told myself it was only because of its sheer size. Its towering frame nearly touched the ceiling, its brass pendulum glinting faintly even in shadow. That night, as I passed it on the way to bed, I thought I heard it ticking. But it was not the measured tick-tock of an ordinary clock. It was uneven, faltering, more like the breathing of someone sleeping fitfully. At 3 a.m, I woke with the distinct sense that someone had spoken my name. The voice was soft, barely more than a sigh, yet it chilled me instantly. I rose, listening, my ears straining against the silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time. "Jonathan!" The sound came from the hallway. I stepped out, the floorboards creaking under my bare feet. The shadows seemed thicker than they had any right to be. The moonlight spilled weakly through the window, landing on the clock's face. It was there, deep inside the dark cavity of the clock, that the voice came again. "Jonathan, help me!" My breath froze. That voice, ragged, weary, trembling, it was Samuel's. My dead brother's. I told myself I was dreaming. I told myself my grief had finally rotted into hallucination. Yet the sound was unmistakable. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached toward the clock's glass door. Inside, the pendulum swayed steadily now, its brass surface glinting like a watchful eye. The second hand twitched in a frantic stutter, then froze altogether. "Jonathan," the voice whispered. "I can't get out." I staggered back, my mouth dry, my heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out his words. I wanted to flee, to put as much distance between myself and that cursed thing as possible, but something stronger than fear held me there. I pressed my ear to the glass. "What do you mean?" I asked before realizing how mad it was to speak to a clock. "It's dark here," Samuel said, his tone desperate. "I can't see. I've been here so long." The pendulum slowed. The air grew colder. "I'm afraid," Samuel whispered. And then I did something I still do not understand. I opened the clock. The instant my fingers touched the pendulum, it stopped entirely, and the hallway's shadows seemed to shiver. A rush of cold wind poured from inside, smelling faintly of damp earth and decay. My vision blurred. I stumbled back, clutching my head as a sharp pain shot through it. When I looked again, the pendulum was moving once more, but the clock's face had changed. The hands were gone, replaced instead by something pale, pressed against the inside of the glass. His face. Samuel's eyes stared at me from behind the glass, wide, sunken, and glistening with the madness of someone trapped far too long. His lips moved slowly. "Jonathan, it's your turn." I slammed the door shut and stumbled away, but even now as I write this, the clock ticks in the hallway, louder each night. And sometimes between the beats I hear a faint voice, no longer my brother's but my own, whispering for someone to let me out. I had not intended to stop at the old manor. In truth, I had never even known of its existence until the wind and rain drove me from the road, the night pressing in with such force it felt like a living thing. The path had twisted unexpectedly, and through the curtain of rain I saw a silhouette, jagged, severe, rising out of the black earth like some forgotten monument. I was cold, my hands numb from gripping the reins, my coat soaked through to my bones. The thought of shelter, any shelter, was enough to override every instinct that whispered caution. The gate was rusted nearly to nothing, hanging at a weary angle. As I pushed it open, it wailed on its hinges, a sound both mournful and accusing. The gravel path beyond was broken and swallowed in weeds, but it led straight to a front door that stood half ajar, as though waiting. I dismounted, my boots sinking into the wet soil, and led my horse to the shadow of the porch, tying him to a warped post. The animal shivered and stamped, tossing his head in agitation. I muttered a soothing word and stepped inside. The air within was cold yet dry, a relief from the biting rain. The hall was enormous, its walls paneled in dark wood that had lost its polish decades ago. The light from my lantern flickered across portraits in heavy frames, the faces obscured beneath a film of dust. Each seemed to follow me with their eyes, though my mind told me it was the shifting flame that made it so. The silence was thick here, oppressive, and it pressed against my ears until I could hear the faint throb of my own heartbeat. I called out, a polite, tentative greeting to any who might reside here, but my voice died before it could fully rise, swallowed by the space. No answer came. My lantern revealed a grand staircase at the far end, its banister carved in twisting shapes that seemed almost alive. The steps were carpeted in something that might once have been crimson but had now faded to the color of dried blood. To my left and right wide doorways opened into shadow. It was then I heard it, a sound so faint I thought at first it was a trick of my mind. It was not the creak of timbers or the sigh of wind through cracks. It was a human sound. Weeping. The hairs rose at the back of my neck. It was not near, but neither was it distant. It seemed to come from within the walls themselves. A woman's sobs, low and unbroken, as if she had been crying for a very long time. My rational mind supplied possibilities. The wind passing strangely through the house, a loose shutter, some bird trapped within. But none of these could quite match the raw sorrow in that sound. I turned in a slow circle, lantern raised, and the crying ceased. My own breath seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that followed. I stood motionless, waiting, listening. After a long moment, I told myself that fatigue and the storm outside had played me false. I needed warmth, food, and a dry place to sleep, nothing more. The room to my right appeared to have once been a parlor. Dust lay thick upon every surface, muting the outlines of chairs, tables, and a cold fireplace whose mouth gaped like some blackened maw. I set my lantern down and began to explore, my footsteps muffled on the worn rug. In the far corner, a door stood partly open. Beyond it, I found a small servant's passage that wound deeper into the house, the walls close and claustrophobic. Here the air grew colder, and the smell of damp stone reached my nose. The sobbing began again. It was closer now. My skin prickled with the knowledge that I was no longer able to tell from where it came. It was above me, below me, beside me, everywhere and nowhere. I gripped the lantern tighter, the metal warm in my palm, and took another step forward. The passage ended in a narrow spiral staircase descending into blackness. The sound grew louder as I stood at its head, trembling ever so slightly. Against my better judgment, I began to descend. My boots struck the stone steps with a hollow sound, and the air became colder still. At the bottom I found a door of iron-bound wood, warped with age. It yielded only slightly when I pushed. Beyond it was darkness too deep for my lantern to fully pierce. Here, the sobbing was so near I could have sworn the unseen woman stood just on the other side. I spoke, softly at first, then louder, assuring her I meant no harm, asking if she was hurt or trapped. My words echoed back to me, but there was no reply, no sound but the sobbing, steady and strange. I pushed harder, and the door opened just enough for me to slip inside. The room beyond was small, no more than a cell with bare stone walls. There was nothing, no furniture, no window, no sign of life. The sobbing ceased the moment I entered. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, for it felt like something was listening to me now, something holding its breath. A sudden draft extinguished my lantern. I stood in complete darkness, my heart pounding. Somewhere in that blackness, very near my ear, a whisper came, too faint to make out words, yet thick with grief. I stumbled backward, groping for the door, my fingers brushing over cold stone until they found the iron edge. I forced my way out, slamming it behind me, and fled up the spiral stairs 2 at a time. By the time I reached the servant's passage, my breath was ragged, my limbs trembling. I tried to tell myself that it was imagination, that I had heard nothing but the tricks of an old house in a storm. Yet as I stood there, struggling to master myself, I heard it again, this time from above me. The weeping had moved. I will tell you this plainly. From that moment onward, I knew I was not alone in that manor. Something moved through its walls, not bound by them as I was. Something unseen but not unfelt. I forced myself toward the grand staircase, intending to search the upper floors, perhaps to find the source of the sound and end this madness. Each step groaned beneath my weight, and my lantern's light threw long, wavering shadows that seemed to recoil from me. The upper hall was lined with more portraits, men and women whose painted eyes seemed both mournful and accusing. One, a woman with pale hair and a gown of silver gray, bore an expression so sorrowful that I could not meet her gaze for long. The weeping came again, now muffled as though behind a door. I followed it to a room at the far end of the hall. The door was locked, but the key still hung from the handle, black with tarnish. I turned it. The lock gave way. The room beyond was a bedroom, long abandoned yet not wholly ruined. A great bed stood against the far wall, its canopy heavy with dust. The curtains were drawn, shutting out the storm. On the floor beside the bed lay a single shoe, small, delicate, its leather cracked. The sound had stopped again. I stepped inside, my boots leaving prints in the thick dust. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, faded perfume clinging to the silence. I reached the bed and drew back the curtains. There was nothing there. But the moment I touched the fabric, the weeping began again, this time directly beneath my feet. The boards felt solid, yet I knew with a certainty that chilled my blood, that there was another chamber below this room, hidden away unseen. And from it came the endless, mournful sobs of a woman who had been weeping for far longer than I could comprehend. I cannot say why I did not flee then and there. Some dreadful compulsion rooted me in place, a need to know what lay below. I searched the room until my fingers found a seam in the floorboards near the bed's foot. The rain had been falling since before dawn, slow and deliberate, as though the sky itself were reluctant to release it. By the time the pale light seeped into my attic studio, the air was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of oil paints and old wood. I had not slept at all the night before. In truth, I had not slept well in weeks. My friend said it was overwork, my physician called it nervous exhaustion, but I knew it was something else, something unspoken, shadowed and waiting. I had always been an artist. Portraits were my specialty, though lately my work felt hollow. I could paint with perfect technique, each line and shade precisely as it should be, yet when the canvas was complete, it lacked the spark of life. Faces looked like masks. The warmth of living eyes never translated through my brush. One night, staring at a half-finished commission, I thought of something that gripped me with sudden urgency. If I could not capture the life of another, perhaps I could capture my own. A self-portrait, not for display or praise, but for truth. Every detail of my face, every shadow and imperfection, rendered with unflinching honesty. The next morning, I placed a mirror before my easel. It was old, with silver peeling at the edges, and in its dim reflection my face looked pale and watchful. Began to work. My hand moved steadily, almost without my guidance, capturing every fold of skin, every subtle shift of light. Hours passed unnoticed. The more I painted, the more I felt that the figure in the mirror was not quite me, or perhaps that I was not quite him. Days passed in this fevered labor. The figure on the canvas grew sharper, more alive than anything I had ever painted. The eyes were my eyes, yet not. They seemed deeper, as if they knew things I did not. When at last I set down my brush, the resemblance was uncanny. Friends came to see it. They praised it as my finest work, though one remarked in passing that the eyes unsettled her. I laughed it away, but her words stayed with me. 3 days later I noticed the first change. A faint shadow at the jawline, almost imperceptible, as though the painted flesh had begun to discolor. I told myself it was the varnish settling unevenly. But the next morning the shadow had spread. The skin had taken on a mottled, sickly tone, as if the painted figure were beginning to rot. I knew my craft. I knew the quality of my materials. There was no natural cause for such a change. Stranger still, the background and clothing remained untouched. Only the face suffered this creeping decay. The days that followed were worse. The painted flesh sagged. The brightness in the eyes dulled. Yet their gaze on me never wavered. I dreamed of the portrait at night. Of myself older with skin like parchment, staring through the darkness. I began to wake in the night to the sound of faint movement in the studio, only to find the painting angled toward me, though I had left it facing the wall. I resolved to destroy it. One evening, under a moonless sky, I carried it to the courtyard and built a fire. But when I lifted it toward the flames, I hesitated. The eyes, my eyes, looked back at me with something that felt like pleading. And then I understood. It was not rot I was seeing. 'Twas age. The portrait was growing older with each passing day. Far older than I was. And when I looked in the mirror afterward, I saw that my own face seemed smoother, my features younger. The years that should have touched me were instead being painted onto that canvas. First, this seemed like a strange gift. I felt lighter, worked with renewed energy. Friends commented on my improved health. But the painting aged without mercy. Wrinkles deepened, hair thinned, teeth yellowed. A faint odor began to cling to it, not of paint, but of decay. I locked it away, but it haunted me still. I saw its eyes in darkened glass, in the shimmer of spilled water, always watching. And I knew there must be an end to this, an end that would come soon. The night of the storm, I woke to find the door open and the portrait standing in the middle of my room. The cloth I had wrapped it in lay in a heap on the floor. The figure was now a corpse, skin clinging to bone, eyes hollow yet glowing faintly red. And still they stared at me. This time I did not hesitate. I dragged it to the hearth and thrust it into the flames. The fire seized it greedily, curling the canvas and blackening the frame. But as it burned, a terrible weakness overcame me. I staggered to the mirror and saw the truth. My skin sagging, my hair gray, my eyes sunken. The years the portrait had borne returned to me in an instant. I collapsed, and when I woke, the fire was cold, the painting gone to ash. Yet sometimes in the window at night, I think I see that withered face watching me still, its eyes holding the same sorrow I saw in the flames.